before served under these commanders, and they were going into terra incognita. They had no idea what was going to lay ahead for them, and they realized that there would be a need for fortification the next year or the next few months down the line. So what better way to test the skills of your men and your leadership abilities than to have the Corps build a fort now when there's no danger, and let's perfect this while we have a chance to do it.
The officers' quarters is the most involved structure because there are two integrated log chimneys that the logs get feathered in between the major timbers. I realized right away that there's as much work in building one of the chimneys almost as there is in building a log cabin, because there's four corners to it. There's the same quantity of notches in a fireplace as there are in the structure itself. The type of notch that Dubois is made from, that we've chosen, is known as a saddle notch. It's the most rudimentary, or one of the most simple notches that can be performed. The saddle notch is basically a log with a half-round circle, and hopefully the half-round circle matches the profile of the log below it, so it sits right down on top of it. It's a great notch. Water can't run inside of it.
It was critical to the success of the expedition that these men worked together. They didn't have to be friends, but they did have to be a team. And I think Clark was very well versed in how to bring men together. He had a knack for it that Lewis didn't seem to have, and it created such a good combination of the two officers. Lewis spent most of the winter in St. Louis taking care of the business aspect of this, making connections and getting supplies, while Clark took care of the men and tried to create this force.
I think a typical day at Camp River Dubois was structured like a day in an average frontier fort of the time. So the men would be up by sunrise and would be starting their work details and things like that. Some of the activities we know they participated in included, just regular camp chores like cutting firewood and hauling things around. They had to dig latrines, things of that nature, and fill them back in.
Obviously daily chores of gathering water, firewood, hunting, drilling.
Some of the specialized things they did that they didn't do other places were things like gathering maple sugar, which they did in the springtime, which was something that they obviously didn't have available to them as they went further west. There would have been a lot of drilling and training that went on to try to form them into a cohesive group. And unlike other military sites, Lewis and Clark allowed the men to hunt. It was kind of unusual for the Army at the time, but of course was perfect for what they needed.
They spent some time shooting and perfecting their marksmanship. And that's reflected in the 3 or 4 occasions when they actually had shooting matches against some of the locals. They lost the first one and then did much better. In fact, the final shooting match right before they left on the expedition, Clark wrote that the enlisted men took all the locals' money.
We have to, first of all, present the least anachronistic museum display for the public so they can get the sense of romance of what camp life was like at Camp Dubois. But we can't have it falling apart within a few years as the original Camp Dubois did. The report was it was in rack and ruin within 4 years. So we have to do a few extra things, like putting the foundation, the hidden foundation, the piers in. I'm doing a special process on the chinking and daubing so that it's not this maintenance nightmare for the museum every year. We've made the doors wider for handicap accessibility, and I've also lined the fireplaces with mortar because
those fireplaces in the period were not safe. Clark's fireplace caught fire. I can't guarantee these won't if people build excessive fires in them. A little fire in there will be fine. It's just my idea of a little fire and someone else's idea of a little fire is maybe two different things. You know, white guys usually build great big fires and sit far away, and Indians built little fires and sit real close. And I suggest people do it in the Indian manner as opposed to the Anglo-Saxon manner of building fires. The barracks have no true fireplace in them. They're just stone hearths. I'm mudding the walls real thick with clay, and then you would build the fire virtually on the floor, and the smoke then wafts up and goes through what looks like a chimney from the outside, but is really a medieval type hood. And I'm sure they were just smoky devils. I wouldn't want to be living inside of those.
We know they got 3 meals a day, and the breakfast was just leftovers from the night before, eaten as a cold meal. Their main meal was at noontime, that was dinner. And so that was the hot meal of the day. That was when the fresh food was cooked and usually made into a stew was the usual thing that they would cook. Everything was supposed to be boiled. And then the other meal was dinner, and that was in the evening before they went to bed, you know, around 7 o'clock or something like that. And that again was kind of leftovers from the ration that they cooked up for their dinner. The food was usually pretty bad in the Army, but they were able to supplement it with the fresh meat that they were hunting around the vicinity. And there'd probably be one big grand parade, as they called it, that was around 5 in the afternoon, when they might even put on their formal uniforms and they would march and kind of show off how well they'd be able to learn the drill and so forth. Because some of the guys that came in weren't in the Army before they signed up for the trek, so all this kind of marching and drilling and everything might have been somewhat new to them. Some of them may have been in militia groups and so forth in their localities, but this constant grind of military life and drilling and training and all the fatigue duties and so forth would have been, I think, especially hard on the 9 young men from Kentucky, as they were known, because it would have been very new to them.
This project just seems like it's never ending. You know, when you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and you're working by 6:30 to 7 in the morning and you don't quit until 5, and then you go home, you eat, you sit down, you fall asleep. And, you know, it starts all over again, and you just have to do it day after day after day.
If we chose saplings, we'd probably be replacing this palisade every year or so. By using these larger white oak logs, I'm hoping to get a minimum of 15 years out of it. I was told by many a farmer a white oak post in the ground will give 50 years of service. It's 9 foot off the ground, and it's all attached by a split oak ribbon, which is the ribbon is attached to the logs by oak pins. And it was very tedious, but the gentleman I worked with from the Lewis and Clark sawmill, we set up a very organized system of doing it. Every man had his job, and just like busy beavers, we kept at it and knocked the palisade out in not much more than a week's worth of effort, really. I would say it was 8 days. We had the palisades all in the ground. 13 months of my life was taken out doing this, and I want this to be over. I want this to be perfect, and I want to go on with my life. I want to get back to the comfort of my own home and my family and my own heart. Well, the last thing was hanging the gates, and the gates are 9 foot. Each one's 4 foot wide, so it's 8 foot across, 9 foot tall, and I built them out of cypress. Again, that was a choice designed toward longevity. I could have made them out of oak, which would have been historically correct. Could have made them probably out of cottonwood around here. Aren't telling what Lewis and Clark actually made their gates out of, because they left us no written account. But I chose the cypress because they were lightweight, and that cypress is highly rot resistant. And the combination of the two makes a very strong gate, very lightweight, so it won't pull itself apart. That's an example of how we balanced historic authenticity with modern practicality.
Camp River Dubois was the place where they were able to organize the group that was going to go west. And so more than a place, it was also a state of mind. You know, it was a training camp. It was a place where a team was forged. And I think that aspect is very important to the success of the Lewis and Clark expedition. The team wasn't forged perfectly. You know, there were still problems that they had during their trip up the Missouri in 1804. There were still punishments that were meted out to them, to various members of the Corps. But for the most part, it brought together different groups of people that had been assembled from different areas.
With all the brawling and fighting and drinking that took place, there were obviously huge disciplinary problems. It could have actually come to the point where they could have rebelled. And in fact, in one circumstance, Clark talked about loading some pistols prior to a court-martial, and it may have been in anticipation of a negative result. These men were barely containable, and they were all jammed in that little fort together in winter conditions. So it was really critical for them to create this sense of camaraderie, and he did it in a number of different ways, and he wasn't always successful. I think the rigors of the journey ahead really brought the final team together.
We know that they were kept busy, and every time they weren't kept busy, it seems like they got into trouble, buying whiskey from people in the locality and stealing things from the neighboring farms and things like that. So it was much better to keep them out of mischief by giving them lots of work to do.
The longest stretches I worked 17 days in a row without taking any time off. That's no fun. It really isn't. And so it really kind of puts your mind in this twilight zone.
I don't think they eased up on them in terms of the pace of the schedule, but they did in terms of the punishments. There was a little rebellion that happened at the camp when neither Lewis nor Clark were there, and men rebelled against Ordway. You see the men who are being punished who kind of worked together to go out to get whiskey, and they left the camp when they weren't supposed to. They were only confined to camp for a week. Well, for the most part, nobody was really leaving the camp anyway, except to go out hunting or something. So, you know, it wasn't a huge punishment, especially in terms of the military at that time, which their favorite punishment was to whip everybody.
I have no desire to live back then whatsoever. If I could jump in a time machine and go back 200 years, I wouldn't do it. Because I know what it was like to try and survive in that element. I am jaded having lived in this century.
The weather wasn't really all that bad. They had kind of a hard January. There was a lot of snow. It was fairly cold, but for the most part, it wasn't a hugely bad winter or anything like that they wouldn't have been used to from their homes. And certainly nothing like the winter that they had at Fort Mandan a year later.
Well, life was difficult in the fort, but it was following military protocol. We know that sentries were posted regularly, that they drilled. We know that at one time it was so cold they changed that sentry every 5 minutes because it was so cold. They didn't have any idea what kind of a winter to expect, I'm sure. These are young men from Kentucky and Virginia that had never been through sub-zero temperatures. Unfortunately, like we had back then, it was a bitterly cold winter even by today's standards or by any standards at all.
What's great about living today is we can take the wonderful things from the past and bring them back to us. As in this case, Camp Dubois. What a pretty fort, what a pretty little camp, and to reconstruct it, we can go there and pretend for just a few minutes and imagine what it would have been like. I can imagine that in the winter of 1803 and 1804, the average man at Camp Dubois was miserable. He was cold, he was wet, he was hungry, he was, filthy.
The fort was tiny. There were so many men crammed in there. It was cold, it was wet, it was very uncomfortable. Clark also wrote about one particularly cold night. He was in a warm room and a thermometer in the corner of the room read 20 degrees. So if you're living inside in the warmest area and it's 20 degrees, the conditions are not comfortable.
I've described this as my midlife crisis. Some men buy Ferraris. I'm building 5 log cabins simultaneously.
The Lewis and Clark Bicentennial is commemorating an event that a lot of people would like to turn back the clock, and they'd like to kind of go on that trek, They'd like to be able to see the country before it was built up and so heavily populated. They'd like to be able to see the, so-called virgin wilderness and the thousands and thousands of animals and the things that Lewis and Clark described seeing. A lot of times I think they forget about the hardships that Lewis and Clark went through and encountered, and what kind of a person you'd have to be to survive and to live through some of those things.
I guess that's my challenge, and here I am, almost 44, and I feel good the fact that physically I've been able to keep up with this every day. I've discovered new medications for joint pain.
When Lewis and Clark came back from their expedition, one gentleman walked up to them and said, "It's as if you've been to the moon and back." Well, that's clearly what it seemed like back then.
I've often thought as I've traveled parts of the trail and tried to envision what it looked like for some of my paintings, what would Lewis and Clark think now if they stood and looked out across the city of St. Louis, or if they could see Bismarck, North Dakota, where Mandan villages once stood? Would they be pleased?
Frontier spirit to them was following orders, doing what Thomas Jefferson